somewhere in the middle of Meditations, in a passage that has since become one of the most quoted ideas in all of Stoic philosophy. Marcus Aurelius wrote about fire. He observed that fire doesn't avoid obstacles placed in its path. It consumes them, turning whatever's thrown in its way into fuel for itself and burning brighter as a result. He used this as a metaphor for how a well-trained mind can treat obstacles in exactly the same way, not as something purely negative to be endured, but as raw material that can actually be converted into progress if approached the right way. This idea sits at the centre of a huge amount of Stoic thinking, even beyond this single passage. The Stoics generally didn't believe you could always control whether obstacles showed up in your life. Illness, betrayal, failure, loss, bad luck. Those things happen to everyone, Stoic or not. What they argued you could control was your interpretation of the obstacle, and specifically whether you treated it as something that only blocked you, or something that could also teach you, strengthen you, or redirect you towards something you wouldn't have found otherwise. It's worth remembering exactly what kind of obstacles Marcus was working with when he wrote this. He wasn't dealing with hypothetical inconveniences. During his reign, the Antonine Plague killed an estimated 5 to 10 million people across the empire, possibly including members of his own family. A war on the northern frontier dragged on for years, forcing him to command troops in freezing conditions far from home for long stretches of his reign. This wasn't philosophy written from comfort, tested only against small annoyances. It was written by a man actively living through some of the worst obstacles his empire had faced in generations. This wasn't naive optimism dressed up as philosophy. The Stoics weren't claiming that every obstacle is secretly good or that suffering doesn't really hurt. Marcus Aurelius endured real plague, real war, real betrayal by people close to him, and none of his writing suggests he found these things pleasant or easy. His argument was more specific than blind positivity. Even when an obstacle can't be avoided or removed, your mind still has a choice about what to do with the situation you're actually in, rather than the situation you wish you were in instead. He gave a fairly concrete example of this kind of thinking. If something happens that prevents you from acting the way you originally planned, that obstacle itself becomes the new starting point for action, not a reason to stop acting altogether. A blocked path forces you to find a different path. A setback in one area might force you to develop patience, or creativity, or resilience you wouldn't have needed to build otherwise. None of that makes the setback pleasant, but it does mean the setback isn't purely wasted if you're willing to actually look for what it's forcing you to develop. There's a practical psychological benefit to thinking this way, separate from whether it's philosophically airtight. People who view obstacles purely as unfair interruptions to a life that should otherwise be going smoothly tend to experience a lot more frustration and helplessness when obstacles inevitably show up, because obstacles feel like evidence that something has gone wrong. People who expect obstacles as a normal, unavoidable part of any meaningful effort tend to handle them with far less internal resistance, because the obstacle isn't contradicting their expectations. It's simply confirming something they already knew was likely to happen eventually. This connects directly back to the dichotomy of control that Epictetus taught. You don't get to choose whether an obstacle appears in your path. You do get to choose how you respond to it once it has. And the Stoics genuinely believed that this second choice, the interpretation, the response, mattered far more to your overall well-being than whatever the original obstacle actually was. It's worth walking through what this actually looks like in a modern situation, because the ancient framing can make it feel more abstract than it needs to be. Imagine losing a job you'd counted on. The obstacle itself, the loss of income, the disruption to your plans, is real, and a Stoic wouldn't pretend otherwise. But within that same event sit several things entirely within your control. How you spend the unexpected free time, whether you use it to develop a skill you'd been putting off, whether you reach out to contacts you'd been meaning to reconnect with, whether you let the setback sour your outlook on every job search that follows, or treat each application as a fresh attempt. None of that undoes the obstacle. All of it determines whether the obstacle becomes purely a loss or also becomes the unexpected occasion for something you wouldn't have pursued otherwise. It's worth being honest about the limits of this idea too. Not every obstacle can be meaningfully reframed into an advantage, and the Stoics weren't arguing that severe tragedy should simply be treated as a hidden opportunity in disguise. Some obstacles are just genuinely painful, and pretending otherwise isn't Stoicism. It's denial wearing Stoic language. What Marcus Aurelius was really describing was something narrower and more useful, a habit of mind that looks for whatever can still be done, whatever can still be learned, whatever forward motion is still available, even inside a situation you never would have chosen for yourself. Fire doesn't get to choose what's thrown into its path either. It just keeps doing the one thing it knows how to do with whatever it's given. Marcus wasn't suggesting people become indifferent to hardship. He was suggesting they stay useful and engaged even inside it, rather than waiting for the obstacle to disappear before they're willing to start moving again. There's a reason this particular passage has outlasted so much of the rest of ancient philosophy in popular memory. It captures something that resonates regardless of era or circumstance. Every generation faces its own version of obstacles that can't simply be wished away. Economic hardship, illness, loss, professional setbacks, personal failures. The specific obstacle changes constantly. The underlying choice Marcus was describing, whether to let the obstacle be purely a stopping point or to treat it as the new material you're now working with, has stayed exactly the same for 2,000 years, which is likely why a Roman emperor's private notes on the subject still circulate as practical advice today, rather than sitting quietly in an academic archive where most ancient writing eventually ends up. There's one more layer worth adding, because it's easy to hear "the obstacle is the way" and turn it into a slogan rather than a practice. Marcus wasn't suggesting you go looking for obstacles or manufacture hardship to test yourself against. That's a different, more performative idea that sometimes gets attached to Stoicism today. His version was quieter and more realistic. Obstacles will arrive on their own, without any help from you. So the actual skill worth building is simply what you do in the 10 minutes after one shows up. Do you spend that time cataloguing everything unfair about the situation? Or do you spend it identifying the one or two things still within your control right now? That's a genuinely learnable habit, not a personality trait some people are born with and others aren't, which is probably the most useful thing about it. It doesn't require becoming a different kind of person. It just requires practicing the same short pause, obstacle after obstacle, until it stops feeling like an effort and starts feeling like how you naturally respond. Consider how this actually plays out with something as ordinary as a rejected proposal at work. A project you put real effort into, pitched with genuine conviction, turned down for reasons that may or may not have had much to do with its actual quality. The purely negative reading treats this as wasted time, a closed door, evidence that the effort didn't matter. The Stoic reading asks a different, more useful question. What does this rejection now make available that wasn't available before? Maybe it's a chance to revise the proposal with information you only have because it was rejected the first time. Maybe it's an opening to build a relationship with whoever gave the feedback, since they've now had to engage with your thinking directly. Maybe it simply frees up time you'd have spent developing something that, in hindsight, wasn't the right direction anyway. None of this requires pretending the rejection didn't sting. It just means the obstacle becomes raw material for the next attempt, rather than a verdict on whether the next attempt is worth making. It's worth noting why this particular passage, out of everything Marcus Aurelius wrote, has travelled so far beyond its original context and into modern self-help and business writing more than almost any other Stoic idea. Part of it is simply the vividness of the image. Fire consuming an obstacle is easy to picture and easy to remember, which matters more for an idea's staying power than most people give it credit for. But part of it is also that the idea solves a genuinely universal problem. Everyone, regardless of era or circumstance, eventually runs into something blocking their plans. A philosophy that offers a workable response to that single, near-universal experience has an unusually wide potential audience, which is likely why a private journal entry written by a Roman emperor managing a war on the Danube frontier still gets quoted, almost word for word in spirit if not in translation, by people facing obstacles that would have been completely unrecognisable to Marcus himself. Subscribe for the next episode. We'll look at Marcus Aurelius's specific approach to something almost everyone deals with regularly: genuinely difficult people.